Hi, I'll continue with paragraph 14 of the chapter on ornaments in general from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art des Klavier zu spielen. Ungeachtet die Sänger sowohl als andere Instrumentisten, wenn sie ihre Stücke gut ausüben wollen, ebenso wenig die meisten von unseren kleinen Manieren entbehren können als die Klavieristen, so haben doch die letzteren ordentlicher verfahren, da sie den Manieren gewisse Kennzeichen gegeben, wodurch die Art, ihre Stücke zu spielen, deutlich angedeutet worden ist. Da man dieser löblichen Vorsicht nicht gefolget ist und im Gegenteil durch wenige Zeichen alles andeuten wollen, so wird den übrigen die Lehre von den Manieren nicht nur viel saurer als den Klavierspielern, sondern man hat auch aus der Erfahrung, dass dadurch viele undeutliche, ja falsche Zeichen entstanden sind, welche noch jetzo zuweilen verursachen, dass viele Sachen nicht gehörig ausgeführt werden. Zum Exempel: Der Mordend ist in der Musik eine nötige und bekannte Manier. Indessen kennen wenige, außer die Klavieristen, dessen Zeichen. Ich weiß, dass dadurch oft eine Stelle in einem Stücke verdorben worden ist. Diese Stelle müsste, wenn sie nicht unschmackhaft klingen sollte, mit einem langen Mordenten herausgebracht werden, welchen niemand ohne Andeutung würde erraten haben. Die Notwendigkeit dieses nur bei den Klaviere bekannte Zeichen dazuzusetzen, weil man kein anderes hat, verursachte, dass man es mit dem Zeichen eines Trillers verwechselte. Wir werden in der Folge aus der großen Verschiedenheit dieser zwei Manieren ersehen, wie unangenehm die Wirkung hiervon gewesen sei. Da die Franzosen sorgfältig in Beisetzung der Zeichen ihren Manieren sind, so folgt hieraus, gleich wie man sich leider bisher überhaupt von ihren Sachen und ihrer guten Art, das Klavier zu spielen, entfernt, dass man auch dadurch zugleich von der genauen Andeutung der Manieren dergestalt abgewichen ist, dass diese sonst so bekannten Zeichen jetzo auch bei den Klaviersachen schon angefangen fremde Dinge zu sein. Die in denen Manieren steckenden Noten richten sich wegen der Versetzungszeichen nach der Vorzeichnung bei dem Schlüssel. Demungeachtet werden wir in der Folge sehen, dass bald die vorhergehenden, bald die nachfolgenden Noten und überhaupt die Ausweichungen eines Gesanges in eine andere Tonart hierinnen eine Ausnahme oft zu machen pflegen, welche ein geübtes Ohr bald zu entdecken weiß. Damit man aber auch denen deswegen sich ereignenden Schwierigkeiten vorkommen möge, so habe ich für nötig gefunden, die Art beizubehalten, vermöge welcher bei allen Manieren die Versetzungszeichen zugleich mit angedeutet werden. Man wird sie in den Probestücken bald einzeln, bald doppelt, wo es nötig gewesen ist, antreffen. I'd like to talk about the relevance of those paragraphs and the relevance of what Bach says is to us in general. What you have there in paragraphs 14 to 16 is Bach. Basically, he's breaking down I don't want to call it the world of music, given so that it can be confused with what I was saying about being in the cage and being in the world of music, so I call it like the music business, let's say. So what you get is Bach giving his assessment of the music business, the state of the music business, what's happening and where it's headed. And so he starts, he starts talking about the singers and the other instrumentalists and saying how the piano players have gone about indicating the ornaments have been much better at it, or much more proper about it. And he goes on to give an example of, he says the result of this is that many there can be many, that even wrong signs can arise. And he gives an example of, how a place in a piece is spoilt as a result. And then he talks about the French and how conscientious they are about assigning, giving their ornaments signs. And that, and he's saying this situation is it's getting to the stage where even the piano players, that even in the piano repertoire, these signs are becoming strange things or foreign objects or unknown things. And he also says that, when he talks about that the piano players are better than the singers and the instrumentalists as far as ornamenting their pieces, so you have a clear indication of how they're meant to be performed, even though the singers and instrumentalists need those ornaments just as much as the piano players do in order to perform their pieces well. That instead of following that example set by the piano players, it's like they're going in the opposite direction. And so instead of wanting a sign to indicate each ornament, they want few signs to indicate everything. So they want to indicate all those ornaments with few signs. And so that's Bach's expert assessment of the situation as it stands and where the things are headed. That it's starting to be that not even piano players know the signs anymore. And this book came out in 1753, and Mozart was born in 1756. So Bach is standing here. He is looking ahead. He's telling us how it is and where it's headed. And ahead of him, Mozart is going to be born. Mozart is not yet born. And Beethoven is going to be there, and Haydn. All these people have yet to come. And here is Bach looking ahead, telling us the situation. And I think this is a unique position he allows us to be in, if you consider what it is he's saying. That normally, if you think of it, and I'm not talking, well, if you think of it, we are in the present here. And let's say, and if we want to learn about Mozart, what we do is we start here and we go backwards till we get to Mozart, and then we stop. So we are approaching Mozart head on. Mozart is going this way, We're going this way till we get to him. Whereas if you take avail of the opportunity that Bach has provided, you get to approach Mozart from behind. You overshoot Mozart, you turn around and you approach him from the behind. So you are traveling in the same direction as Mozart is traveling. And just like and I think approaching an event, in order to properly understand a time in history, you have to approach that time from the past. So that time, in order to understand it like the people who experienced it understood it, that event has to be seen as being in the future rather than being in the past. So you have to approach it from the past, and it has to be the future as you approach it. If you approach it from the present, it's the past you're approaching, not the future. And when you think about it, if you look at Mozart head on, face to face, his left is your right and your right is his left. Everything is backwards. You are not seeing what he sees. He sees everything in the whole landscape behind you. He sees that what you don't see. And what you're looking at is not what Mozart's looking at. You're looking at what's behind him and not what's in front of him. You are not seeing the same thing. Or you could look at it this way in terms of, if you think the music business, and if you think the music business for Bach and the music business for Mozart and the music business for Beethoven, and if you think of them as buildings, well, Bach, Mozart and Beethoven, they're all entering these buildings through the front door. Each of them is entering through the front door, as are you when you are approaching the future. You do not enter the music business in any other way but through the front door. Whereas when you're coming from the past going backwards, you're always entering these buildings through the back door. You go in the back door, you're going out the front door, in the back door and out the front door. So if you never look behind you, you never see the front door. You are only seeing the things the people you're interested in don't see. Because if they enter the building, and let's say they go from one building to the next, they enter through the front door, they see the facade of the building, they see the front door. But if they don't look behind them when they leave the building, they don't see the back door, they don't see the back of the building, they are looking at the front door of the next building. If you're not looking behind you, you never see what they see. You never see the front door of the building, you never see the facade of the building, you only ever see the back of the building and the back door. So you are not getting the same perspective as they got when you approach history from the future. History has to become the future in order to be able to understand it. And I'm not talking as a historian, I'm not a historian. This is just my experience. You have to, and you could as well take an analogy of a train, like in an action film, where you imagine the action hero is in a car and he's jumping onto a moving train. Well, if you imagine the train coming and the hero traveling in his car towards the train, he's not going to be able to jump onto the train And if you think what that hero sees in his car, you know, the landscape rushing by, it's not the same as what the people on the train are experience when they see the landscape passing by. It's the opposite. And for the only way to work and to jump onto a moving train is to be traveling in the same direction as the train. And then the hero can jump on. You're never going to see the car going this way and the train going that way and the hero jumping onto the train. It's not going to happen. And I think that works the same in history. So this is an opportunity, what Bach provides here. Contemplate those words, and you are looking. You can see the state of the music business from Bach's perspective, looking forward, approaching the time of Mozart and Beethoven. And you will see the scores of Beethoven and Mozart differently than when you're looking from the future. It's like as well, you know, if you see a car from the 80s on the street nowadays, you do not perceive that car in the same way as people in the day perceived it. You know, because you're perceiving it from the perspective of coming from the future. So you look at it in terms of cars in 2022, and then you might see that they were simpler, or they weren't so sturdy, or, you know, so solid in the 80s. And you'll have a certain nostalgia, and you think that they're quite basic and whatever. You are seeing it from a perspective. You are seeing it from the future. Whereas the person in the 80s who saw in that car, they might see how modern it looks, how state-of-the-art it is, you know, how futuristic it looks. The way, for them, it's impossible for them to see it the way you see it from the future. It's the only way they can see it the way you see it is they have to be able to predict the future and then look at it. And it's the same for Mozart and Beethoven. They will not have understood their scores in the way you understand their scores, because you are looking at it knowing what comes afterwards. And you're mistaking. Everybody is mistaking that perspective as being a valid perspective. You know, you look at that score and you see what it's missing, because you're used to expression marks and all. So the most common thing you'll hear about a Mozart score is that it lacks expression marks. But Mozart would not have thought in a million years that his score lacks expression marks. Not for a second, because they weren't necessary at the time. And I'm not saying they're not necessary because of the limitations of the instruments, not at all. And I'm not saying they weren't necessary because the people were less expressive. Mozart was more expressive than the top artists nowadays. I would assert that, and I'm not afraid to assert that. So it's that there was more expression. There will have been more expression in the way Mozart plays his music than in the way his music is played nowadays. So it's down to that. But his scores lacked nothing. And he couldn't have possibly, when we go through Bach's book, you'll find that he doesn't talk about crescendos or any of those expression marks. As far as Mozart will be concerned, his scores contain absolutely all the information one needs to accurately perform them. But what we do learn from this is that, assuming Bach is correct, what we learn from this is that when Bach sees a Mozart score, he'll see that his prediction of where it's headed is actually headed this way. And what Bach will see is he'll see those few signs that are used to indicate all the ornaments. And he'll think, yeah, that's not good. Because you could interpret from this as well that Bach is sharing his motivation to writing the book here in those paragraphs. That it is to fight this. He is afraid of the onset of ignorance, which could threaten the survival of his music, of the music of his time, of the only music that's important to him. And Mozart will have entered that same climate, looking in the same direction as Bach. And Mozart will know that there's, the trend is to use few signs to indicate all the ornaments, and he'll know that. And, he'll go along with that. So he might not be as upset about it as Bach is, but he as well knows that there are few signs being used to indicate all the ornaments. So we won't be thinking, so Bach will think that about the Mozart score. But he won't be thinking there's hardly any expression marks in the score. He won't be thinking that. That there's no ritardandos or any of that sort of stuff. He's not going to be thinking that, because as far as he's concerned, that's not missing. Whereas us from the future, we are concerned about the lack of expression marks in a Mozart score, and that there's very little indication of how to play it. But we're not concerned with the fact that there's few signs there to indicate everything. And in terms of how correct Bach is, that example that he gives of the mordant, when I read it, in light of that video I did on edition shot with the fingering on the paragraph and the chapter on fingering, and having to address the errors that edition shot, the urtext edition made, in terms of, because the whole point of the paragraph was Bach deliberately had his stems going up or down to indicate which hand should play the notes, and edition shot, in their ignorance, they didn't know that those instructions existed because they're not aware of what's in this book. They undermined all that and ruined Bach's deliberate efforts to help us. And as well, so I pointed that out in the video, but I as well pointed out the other errors that they made, because they make a huge amount of them, considering the reputation that urtext editions enjoy. It's huge. What a dog's dinner they make of the score. One of those mistakes that edition shot are making was that they are mistaking a long ornament for a trill. So they would have you, if you trust edition shot, if you trust Urtext editions, and you feel you're doing it right because you are following the Urtext edition, you will be ruining the effect of that place in the piece. You will be doing something by playing a trill instead of a long mordant. You will be doing something that Bach would consider to be very unpleasant. And when I read that, I mean, I didn't have that in mind when I made that video talking about the errors in the edition shot. I just made that video because that was the thing to address regarding that paragraph. It just got in the way. But when I read this paragraph, I thought, wow. I mean, it kind of, it's hard for me to remember exactly, but it had a big effect. I kind of forget, and then I start to doubt, and I wonder if I ever had that reaction. But I had the reaction where I thought, wow, Bach is actually pointing out the exact mistake made by an Urtext edition in 2023, naming it exactly in the year 1753, a mistake that they are making still today, and that every academic person, as a result of, that they are blindly following the Urtext edition with the idea that it's infallible and that it's superior, more evolved. They are all making that mistake, and Bach calls it out in 1753. I think that is a very strong example of how relevant it is. Plus, what he talks about there, about how the trend is to want to have few ornaments to indicate everything. And how it's gotten to the point where even piano players are starting to lose sight. You could, if you think of paragraph 11, the end of that, when Bach talks about, you could call them categories. He says in what you could call the first category is those scores where all the ornaments are indicated, and one can be unconcerned. One doesn't have to do anything. Everything is done for them. So that's one category of kind of requirement, let's say, for the performer. The second category is those scores where little or nothing is indicated, and that the performer or interpreter or piano player has to furnish the piece with ornaments according to the usual way or the conventional manner. That could be the second category. And you could consider this, what he's talking about here in these paragraphs 14 to 16, that he's introduced a third category. And he is standing on the cusp of this, so it's like his prognosis for the future. And it's like he's creating, he's not in a direct way, not in a spoon-feeding way, but he is introducing a third category for, what that reflect the performer's duties. And that is a score that is indicated where few signs are used to indicate everything. And this category, he sees it coming. It's not entirely established there. The French way of playing and all, he's still familiar with it. It's not entirely gone. It's, people were distancing themselves from it at that time. This had not yet come into play. Bach is looking into the future, and he is predicting a third category that performers are going to have to in a score where few signs are used to indicate everything, performers are going to have to know which ornaments those signs are referring to, because the signs do not themselves specifically indicate the ornament that is meant to be played at that moment. And this category, this third category, is the one that, in terms of performing Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, this is the category that's relevant to us. So Bach, and I find that incredible, Bach predicted in 1753 the category that has not yet established himself in his time, but that is completely relevant to us in 2022. A category that, nobody knows. I am the only one connecting paragraph 11 to paragraph 14 to 16. I am the only one who has deduced the three categories, and that third category being the one that is relevant for us. So that is two instances that show how relevant what Bach says is. And one of the greatest obstacles in terms of reaping the rewards that this book has to offer is that thought that what you're reading is not relevant. And I've had that thought. I've encountered things in that book where I thought, oh no, this is not relevant for me, and I've thought this doesn't come up in Mozart, or this doesn't come up in Beethoven. This isn't relevant. And I have found that it was relevant. And the only reason I thought it wasn't relevant was my ignorance. That was the only reason. And it was my arrogance that had me say, this isn't relevant to me. And I would say that that arrogance is a part of ignorance. And the greater the ignorance is, the greater the arrogance is. And I would see ignorance as, first of all, ignorance is not your friend. The ignorance in me is not my friend. And it seems to me that ignorance fights for its survival. It wants to survive. I find it kind of strange when I think about it in that way, but it's almost like it's the way a virus would fight for its survival, so too does ignorance. And one of the defenses ignorance has to guarantee its survival is arrogance. And I think the greater the ignorance in a person, the greater the arrogance is going to be. And arrogance is not our friend either. Ignorance is not our friend. Arrogance is not our friend. And so arrogance will hide itself from you. Arrogance is not obvious. It doesn't want to be detected. So you might think generally you don't think you're better than everybody else, therefore you're not being arrogant. But thinking this is not relevant for me is arrogance. And if you hear those words that Bach is saying, and if you think they are relevant, or if you don't assume that they're irrelevant, and you examine the music or keep that with you, what Bach has said, if you find out it's not relevant after examining it after, keeping it with you, thinking about it when you encounter the music of Mozart or Beethoven or any of these people. You will learn more out of that thinking Bach's words are relevant than if you think right away those words are irrelevant and forget about them. You will learn nothing, and ignorance has ensured its survival. Whereas if you're not arrogant, if you think these words are relevant, you might find out that they actually are relevant, but you will learn more. Ignorance it's going to lose territory when you can cut out the arrogance. And that we think, and I would say this in terms of, if you think of the example Bach gave with the long mordent, Bach says the mordent calls the mordent necessary in 1753, 3 years before Mozart is born. In 1759, if you're to believe, the Mozart biographies, Mozart will have begun, his path in the music business. So that's 6 years. No, wait. Well, okay, so 9 years after Bach says that, how important the long mordent is, Mozart will be beginning his journey through the music business. And if you're to think the long mordent, I'll bet nobody can think of a long mordent in Mozart. Nobody has encountered a long mordent in Mozart's piano sonatas. And if you think critically, or just leave it down to your gut instinct, does that make sense? Does that make sense that an ornament that was necessary in 1753, an ornament that meant the difference between a part of a piece being ruined and being unpleasant, or the true effect of the piece coming true, that such an ornament can basically disappear off the face of the planet in the space of 20 years, let's say, or 25 years. Does that seem reasonable? Or would that not seem a bit weird? Because if you take it in kind of recent times, if you think of Jimi Hendrix, again to use Jimi Hendrix, do you think there's what he did in a guitar is not done, what wouldn't have been done by Guns N' Roses or Metallica then, or wouldn't be known or used at all by Guns N' Roses and Metallica? It's not going to happen. They all using everything Jimi Hendrix did on the guitar. So, does it make sense that you're not going to have a long mordent in Mozart when Bach only not that long beforehand was saying how necessary it is? So does that not feel a bit kind of weird? And that we think, and we're thinking it's not relevant, is because we're ignorant to its existence. And we've been brought up in a climate where, the ignorance of publishers, like Edition Shot or G. Henley for Lag, or of the universities of all these experts, because they don't mention it, because they're not aware of its existence. Through our arrogance, we think because we haven't heard of it, it doesn't exist. But it seems a bit absurd when one thinks about it logically and thinks that, hold on, Bach belonged to the real world. He was a real person, and so did Mozart. And Mozart met Bach. Mozart said of Bach, he is the father, we are the children. Anybody who knows anything at all knows it because of him. And anybody who doesn't admit it is a bleep. That's what it said that Mozart said about Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach when he met him in Leipzig there in the last few years of his life. So there will be a tendency to think those words aren't relevant. But you're going to find out how relevant they are. And I think, and it means if you're a student, you do not have to mimic or copy the older generation. There is a whole world of kind of potential and things that they are ignorant to. They are ignorant to a lot. And it's there for you to discover. And you will be able to discover it here on this channel. So you get to look. You get to go past Mozart. You get to look ahead into a music business into which Mozart is going to be born, into which Beethoven exists. And you get to see the score from Bach's perspective with these paragraphs. If Bach was, if you were given a sort of a chance to sit down with Bach, and somebody said to you, okay, you have 15 minutes, you can sit down with him and he's going to talk. Let's say time travel was possible and you got to travel back in time and do that. You would be trying to hear every single word he says. You'd be hanging off every word he says. You wouldn't want to miss anything because you'll want to remember it. You'll want to know exactly what he says afterwards. And it could be that you sit down with Bach and he talks about that, the state, his assessment of the music business, of where it is and where it's headed. And when you think about it, Bach is talking about people. When there's all this talk about authentic performance and stuff, the people living in the time, Bach is talking about how they are not performing the pieces authentically, that they don't know in Bach's day. And when you do understand how identical the mistakes that they are making are to the mistakes that Edition Shot cause us to make, you will see that inauthentic performance what existed as then a days as it does nowadays. And you could kind of as well get into Bach's mind and understand when he says about adding the accidental signs on the ornaments. You know, the way on a turn you might have a sharp sign above the sign of the turn, and then a sharp sign underneath it. And when that turn is on a F sharp, that would mean that the G is sharp and the E is sharp. So you'd be playing G sharp, F, E sharp, and F sharp to play that turn. And how he is keeping that, preserving that way of doing it. You know the reason why he's doing that, because he believes that if you don't indicate the ornaments, if you use few signs to indicate all the ornaments, you're going to start playing the pieces wrong. You won't be performing them correctly. You're going to be ruining them. You're going to be making them unpleasant. And so this, you can see that this is a kind of a knock-on or a follow-up to that. So you know where Bach is coming from. You can think like Bach taught. And if you consider those words, if you really think about what it is Bach is describing, because as well, let's say there's a YouTube video where Bach himself talks, and he says, and the video is Bach breaks down where we are in music and where we're headed. Normally, everybody should be clicking onto that and interested and would take what he says seriously and wouldn't think it's not relevant. And I think it's incredible how relevant Bach has proved himself to be. And I think anytime you think you dismiss what I read or the translation you read on the screen, if you dismiss it as being irrelevant, you are missing out on the chance to discover things that exist that you had no idea they exist, and that the music business has no idea exists. We are living in what Bach predicted. The ignorance that Bach warns of basically in those paragraphs actually happened. And we are now victims of that ignorance, and our arrogance stops us from discovering it. It preserves that ignorance. We don't think there's anything missing in our superior urtext editions, in our superior expertise. I mean, nobody thinks of the scores in, when you think of people in the 1940s or 50s or 30s, and people will sort of laugh in a kind of a feeling superior that when they think of the piano scores they worked from, where there was all the editorial additions of expression marks and stuff. So you'll get a Mozart sonata full of crescendos and diminuendos and romantic expression marks, and we'll kind of laugh in a way at how ridiculous it is, because we work from the urtext edition. We're so much more advanced, and we think if we don't know it, if we don't know it, it doesn't exist. That's what we are thinking. And that's why we don't actually discover what is there, what is missing, because we assume there is nothing missing. If we don't know about it, it's not missing, it doesn't exist. And I can see with those, what Bach is talking about, wanting to indicate everything through a few signs, I can see how that would be seen as progress, because that sort of stuff is still seen as progress. And just as the way the scores were edited, in the 1930s and all, with the expression marks, that will as well have been seen as progress, because the Romantic period advanced everything. And so they add all the expression marks to the scores, to Mozart scores, because it's improving things. And the thing is, with the having few signs to indicate everything, that's could be seen as streamlining, efficiency. We've evolved. We do not need. The problem is, you could see them as shortcuts. And the problem with shortcuts is that if you don't know the long way round, a shortcut can pretty quickly make an idiot of a person. And an example would be, when I was in Vienna. Let's say I'm at the opera house and I want to go to Maria Hilferstrasse. The way I'd do it would be with the U-Bahn, the underground. And so I'd take the subway to Maria Hilferstrasse and get out there. So that was basically the shortcut to Maria Hilferstrasse. But there was one time where I was in the opera house and I didn't have to fare for the subway to get to Maria Hilferstrasse. So I was stranded. I couldn't get to Maria Hilferstrasse. But what I didn't know was that it was only about a 10-minute walk, 15-minute walk to get there. It wasn't far. But as far as I'm concerned, no, I thought there was no way to get to Maria Hilferstrasse, because all I knew was the shortcut. So I was pretty much an idiot, standing, just a 10-minute walk away, thinking, how am I going to get there? So that's an example of how only knowing the shortcut can make an idiot of you. And it will go the same as well with when I posed that question about knowing the fundamentals of harmony, how that will influence, how that does relate to choosing ornaments. It's only knowing the shortcut, your shortcut way of understanding harmony, that leaves you completely unable to answer that has you disliking me, or has you running, scared, because it's an uncomfortable situation to be put in, where you have to answer something you have no clue what the answer is. So that, so it will, what Bach was warning against, the few signs to indicate everything, that will be seen as progress. And Bach knew better, and as a result, he created a third category which didn't yet exist, but one that is relevant to us in 2023. And he called out the exact mistakes that an Urtext edition still makes in 2023. And the arrogance as well will, a lot of people might think edition shot, well, everybody knows G. Henley Verlag is the best. So that arrogance will immediately kick in as soon as you hear that. But do you not think I'd be able to point out all those omissions, the ignorance of G. Henley Verlag too? Do you think that they don't exist? And it's thanks to the insight that I've gained from this book that I'm able to do that. And that I was able to, that I can look at this score of the Bach piece without knowing anything and know they're wrong. I know where they're wrong, and know those ornaments where I think, no, there's no possible way Bach could have put that ornament there. And it'll happen the same with me in Mozart. I'll see, places that aren't even debated, where I know Mozart did not have this ornament there. That ornament is plainly wrong. But G. Henley Verlag don't know that. And either do the people playing those pieces. You can hear it, they don't know it, because they play those ornaments without, totally oblivious to how wrong they are. And that is what you'll be able to, that's what you stand to gain from this book. So that's it. Oh, one last thing. In paragraph 16, in that last sentence, there's, in this sentence, dass dieses sonst so bekannten Zeichen jetzt so auch bei den Klaviersachen schon angefangen, fremde Dinge zu sein, that normally you could think that if you know the German, that haben would be missing. And that you'd normally be saying, dass dieses sonst so bekannten Zeichen jetzt so auch bei den Klaviersachen schon angefangen haben, fremde Dinge zu sein. That's missing. I'll just say that at the time it was accepted that you'd leave out haben. That was not necessary, whereas nowadays in modern German, haben would be included. So that wasn't an error of Bach's, or that's the way it was done then. Just a by the way. Well, that's it for those paragraphs. And that was it. The relevance of what Bach, how relevant it is what Bach is saying. So, thanks for watching. Bye.